everyone. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. It's good to see everyone with us this evening on certainly an eventful day, to say the least, for all of us. Hopefully, first of all, wishing everybody hopefully everyone's safe and healthy, both for a number of reasons, and God willing that we get through this. Inshallah. My name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities in the United States. We're so happy to have you for our wonderful new series with our dear friend Rabbi Aaron Haleva. This two-part series we're focusing on Don Quixote and the Talmud, looking at the historic connections between these two fascinating texts. Just a little bit of background, this is all through our brand new Sephardic Digital Academy, an online new learning platform we have for Ladino language and culture, Sephardic cooking, Torah, Halakha, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about all of the wonderful courses, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. With that, just a few words about Rabbi Haleva, who's a dear friend of ours who received his smicha through Rabbi Jose Faor, Bendicha Memoria, a wonderful and dear community rabbi. Rabbi Haleva actually grew up in Seattle, in the Sephardic community in Seattle. He comes from a Turkish background, originally Turkish Jewish, and we were very excited to have him with us this evening. Without further ado, I'll turn over the floor to Rabbi Haleva. Bechavod, Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Ethan. So, have you ever heard the phrase "lodos con caños," or if you're Rodesli, "lodus con caños"? Anybody ever hear that before? You know what it means? It means, so lodo means mud. So there's a famous saying, "Se metió su cara en el lodo." He put his face in the mud. That means kind of put you on the spot, right? But lodos are people who come from the mud, like the wrong part of town, like you might say gente baixo. But I never understood why we say that the low-class people have canes. Caños are canes. So this phrase, you're going to understand between tonight and next week, same time, same channel, why we have this Ladino saying lodos con caños. It comes from a Sugya, a pericope, which is the unit of study of the Talmud. And there's something strange about that Sugya. It's in Masechet Nedarim. Nedarim is about vows and oaths. You take an oath in court. Well, there's something strange. Now, I always knew that the printed text of the Talmud is faulty. We used to have very nice versions of the text of the Talmud in southern Spain. Somehow, after the expulsion and all those events, the text got a little bit lost in the shuffle, and the printed version of the Talmud has a lot of errors in it. They tried to correct it somewhat in the famous Vilna edition that you see in many synagogues. So there's the big ones. But they don't have a totally correct, it's called in Hebrew girsa. Girsa is the version of the text. Lo and behold, there's a sugya in Masechet Nedarim, which is on daf, the page 24 through 25, where there's an interesting story, but it's the text is faulty and it doesn't really jive. And you're going to see how when we get there. Do you know where the best version of that sugya is? In Don Quixote. In book 2, there's a story you may, if you know Quixote and Sancho Panza, who's his sidekick, who's a short guy and who's fat. That's why he's called Panza. Panza means belly. And he is an old Christian. And it appears from the way Quixote is written, and I'll tell you how, Quixote is a new Christian. It means he has Jewish blood. And just so you know, I'll give you a little head note. The name of the book is, and let me pull it up so everybody can see it. Let's say I have to do a share screen, very good. And let's pull Quixote, and here is Quixote with Spanish. Can everybody see this paper I have up here?
No, we just see your display. We don't see the Word doc.
Okay, so how do I, let's see. It says screen sharing. Maybe I have to do new share. Let's do it that way. Here, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Good. So the name of the sugya is famous for those who studied Talmud. It's called Kanya de Rava, which means El Caño de Rava, the cane of Rava. Rava was a famous Emorah. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in a city called Pumbedita, which is a very important city in Babylonia for the editing and production of the Talmud. You may have heard of him. He was a co-litigant, let's say, or he argued quite a bit with someone named Abaye and Rabbah, and they have many, many disputes. All of them ended up in favor of Rabbah, except for 6. And why is that? Well, Abaye died, Rabbah became Rosh Yeshiva, and he convinced everybody that he was right, except in 6 cases he could not. And Prove de Abaye pasó a la mejor vida. He died, so he really couldn't say anything. So that's why in most of the cases, the famous mahlokot, disputes on Jewish law between this Rabbah and Abaye, are in favor of Rabbah. But in 6, he couldn't succeed. Anyhow, so Kanya de Rabbah, the cane of Rabbah, that's the name of the story, which has a certain interesting legal conclusion. And that's the Sugya. Sugya is the unit of the Talmud. In Greek, they call it perikope, if you know Greek. Pericope in English. That is best produced. The world's only copy of the correct Girsa is in Don Quixote. Now, let's look at this phrase a little bit. Quixote doesn't mean anything in Spanish. De la Mancha, of the stain. There's an area in Spain. It's kind of in the boondocks. It's on the very south extremes of Castile, in the center. There's really nothing there. That's called La Mancha. So that's kind of the cover story, as if this Don Quixote is from La Mancha. But now remember, Cervantes wrote this book in the 1500s. Do you know how you pronounce this word here in 1500 or 1550, let's say? Anybody know? How do you pronounce this letter in the 1500s? So how do you say drawer in Ladino? Cachón, right? In Judeo Spanish, cachón. Ponlo en el cachón, bre. Put it in the drawer, kid. So cachón is spelled C-A-X-O-N. So we pronounce the X as a sh. And by the way, that's why Mexico is called Mexico. When the conquistadores went to Mexico, in their language, the indigenous peoples used to call each other Mexico. So when the Spaniards wrote what they heard, they wrote M-E-X-I-C-O. Later, which says Mexico. Later, when the Spanish sound system underwent a transformation, everybody pronounced the X as X, then it became Mexico. But originally it's Quixote, Don Quixote, the master of Quixote, who has a stain. Does anybody recognize the word Quixote? How about Quixote? Quixote means truth in Aramaic. And if you remember the Berich Shemeh prayer, which everybody recites when you take out the Sefer Torah, Ladino Jews like to read it in Ladino. At the end of it, it says, De oratehe keshot, his Torah is truth. Unbiohe keshot, and his prophets are truth. Umaske leme'abad tavan ukshot, and God, talking about God, and he's continually doing good for us and truth. Okay, so if you read this as Don Quixote, now it becomes master of truth, de la Mancha, not from the place La Mancha, which is just like nowhere, but of the master of truth who has a stain. What's the stain? Well, the stain is that he has Jewish blood. So he's a new converso, but as you're going to see when we get there next week, when he and his sidekick, who's really inept and you would never appoint governor of anywhere, they show up in this place called Barataria, which means cheap land, you know, from like we say, barato or baratu. They appoint Sancho the governor. And it really doesn't make sense unless you take into account that a new Christian walking around Spain in the 16th century is kind of lost in a way and does not get the benefit of the doubt from pretty much anyone. So he is Don Quixote, the master of truth. What is his truth? We'll get to it. The man who has the stain. Very good. Now, in order for us to understand why Lodus have caños, why lower people have canes, I need to show you another, how do I do a new share? Another document, which is this one. Okay. This is the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah in a tractate called Kelim. Kelim means vessels or tools. And this is in the, so the Mishnah is organized into 6 general headings called Sedarim. In Spanish, we call them órdenes. I don't know if you know this song on Pesach, Quien supiense entendiense. Quien supiense entendiense. It's sung at the end of the Haggadah. So it has numbers, and who knows the number 6, who knows the number 5, all that kind of thing. The number 6 is Sidre Mishnah, but in Espanol it's Seis órdenes de la Mishnah. So there's 6 general headings. We call those órdenes. This is the 6th and last, called Tahorot. Deals with purity. Purity in the sense of legal purity, because you couldn't enter the temple if you were impure, and if you were a Kohen, you couldn't eat any of the gifts to the Kohanim, like terumah, like hallah, like the parts of the animal that every Israelite gives the Kohen when he slaughters one. You couldn't eat any of those if you're impure. So we have a whole orden, a whole heading that deals with what is pure and what is impure. The general rule is vessels or tools or utensils that have a hole in them, or not a hole, a cavity. They have a cavity in which something else could be contained. They are impure. They become impure. Vessels like a fork or a knife or anything like that, not a spoon, but anything that doesn't hold water or liquid in any part of it, has no internal cavity, no external cavity, like a bowl, does not generally become impure. Now there's some exceptions to, or apparent exceptions to the rule of a straight vessel with no cavity doesn't become impure. And now this is a Mishnah in the 17th chapter of Kelim, and this is the 16th halacha. The Mishnayot are divided into paragraphs, and we call that halacha. So I'm going to read that for you now. Kene moznaim vehamachok sheyesh bahen bet kibul matechet. So kene is kanyo, but it also means a pole, a pole. Kene moznaim. Moznaim is a balance. Those old balances where there's 2 little bowls and there's a crossbar above, and the bowls are hanging by little chains from the edge of the crossbar, and you have a set of weights, and you put your weights on one side and you put whatever you're selling on the other, flour, nuts, gold dust, jewelry, whatever it is. And when you sell by weight, and when they balance, that's you owe me 50 kilos worth of gold, 50 kilos worth of, or 50 grams, let's say, worth of sugar, etc. So a moznaim, a balance, has a crossbar. That's the kine moznaim. Ve'hamahok. Now, when you used to sell like flour or grain or anything of that nature, that when you put it in the pan of the scale, it makes like a heaping teaspoon, like it doesn't stay flat across. So they used to want to make it flat across so that the weighing would be more precise. So there's something called a mahok. You may have seen it. It's a little wooden, like a pointer for the Sefer Torah, but it has a little, like a hand on the end of it, or a little curve like this, It's a long, long thing like my hand, and there's a little curve. You sweep across the bowl of the moznaim, of the scale, to make it flat, perfectly flat. That's a mahok. Sheesh bahen bet kibul matechet. If they have an internal hidden cavity where you could put metal, why would you do that? To skew the balance. So you want to tip the balance. And we always say he put his thumb on the balance. Well, you can see when someone does that, but how do you do it secretly? On the crossbeam, you put a little piece of lead inside the wood, so it's not really balanced anymore. And when you let go of it, it dips down more, making it appear that a larger weight of merchandise is being bought by the customer, and you charge more for giving less. And you could also do it in the mahok. So when you smooth it off, it kind of pushes the balance downward. V'ha'esel sheyesh bo bet kibul ma'ot. An esel is, let me just see what it is. Oh, that's right. So have you ever seen people in the Middle East, or in the old days, they would go around selling merchandise with a pole across their shoulders, and they would hold all the merchandise on the sides. And that's how they would carry things. That's how one man could carry a lot of things. Even till today, you can see it in certain Arab countries where they have like water or some kind of drink, and he has like a big thing on 2 cavities on this crossbeam. That's an esel. Sheyesh bo bet kibul ma'ot. Now, in this crossbeam that you put across your shoulders, he hollowed out a cavity, and you could stick money in there. So why would you do that? Because when someone puts down their money and you're giving them change, you secret away some of the change and stick it in the crossbeam very surreptitiously, and they don't know that you kind of stole part of their change. That's a kind of dishonest way of selling whatever you're selling. And a pole of a poor person, this is like a staff, sheyesh bo bet kibul mayim, that has an internal cavity to hold water. So often what poor people would do is they would sit out in the streets, in a busy street or like a main plaza, and they would act like they're so poor that they haven't had anything to eat and they're weak and they don't have anything to drink and they're like all just about to keel over, and people hopefully give them, out of sympathy or more sympathy, extra money. So how can you sit 8 hours in the town square and pull this off? You have to secretly put some water into your staff, and when nobody's looking, you kind of lift it up to your mouth and you drink from the internal cavity. That allows you to stay for a long period of time in begging mode. Umakel sheyesh bo bet kibul mezuzah margalit. And a staff, another name for a staff, a kaneh is a bigger pole, like a walking stick. A makel is like a cane that has an interior cavity which would hold a mezuzah or a pearl. So sometimes the poor people would go on the doorstep of homes and ask for a food or old shoes or money. And while they're waiting for the owner to, he opens the door a little bit and says, oh, it's an ani, it's a poor person, I'll help you, just wait a minute. While the owner goes back, usually the housewife goes back in the kitchen or something, he steals the mezuzah, or he steals a pearl that's in their house if they let him in, or some kind of gem, and sticks it in the little cane, and no one sees him doing it, and he can walk out of there with some valuables into the interior cavity. All of these things that I just told you about, these types of vessels, they're kelim, they can become tameh because they have actually a secret bet kibul, which means a cavity. It means literally in Hebrew a house, which means like an area or a structure. Kibul mai, kibul, that allows you to accept something. We call that an interior cavity. So although you wouldn't think a long cylindrical pole or cane or that little fork that you use to smooth over the amount of powder in a scale would be mekabel tum'ah, it's called, capable of becoming legally impure because it has no opening. Lo and behold, it does have an opening, and it's a secret opening, and because of this, they're teme'im. Now, what's significant about this? Because you wouldn't otherwise think so. Ve'al kulan amar Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. So this Mishnah really is either authored by or commented on Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. This is very early, that means. Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, if you may remember, he founded the academy at Yabne. He was the one who had that little give and take with Vespasian, who was at the time a general, putting on a siege of Jerusalem. And he told Vespasian, you're going to be the next emperor. And he said, oh, don't say that. Tiberius will hear about it. And lo and behold, Tiberius dies and he's the next emperor. So Vespasian said, what do you want? I'll let you out of the city. And what do you want? And he said, I want Yabne v'hahameha. I want to leave Jerusalem, safe passage. You let me set up an academy in Yabne, and hopefully I can preserve our culture. He let him do that. He's the famous Yohanan ben Zakkai. His teacher was none other than Hillel HaNasi. So he's either the author of or a commentator on this Mishnah, which he had. And Ve'al Kulan Amar Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, Oili im omer, Oili im lo omer. So on all of these, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said, I'm kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. If I teach the law in these cases, people who aren't criminals are going to learn how to be criminals. If I don't teach the law, I'm leaving out an important law in the rules of purity and impurity. Either way, I feel bad. There's a negative to either side. I don't know what to do. Oili means like, why the me? Woe is me. But he did it, of course, because he's not going to leave out an important law from the Mishnah. The purpose of the Mishnah was to preserve the entirety of Jewish law after the Roman conquest. So, of course, we put this in, and that's the issue. Now you know why low people have caños, canes. And now we're going back to the Quixote article. Let's see, here it is. Okay. Can everybody see I switched articles. Can you see that? I hope. Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. Now, let me tell you. So this deal, because this is in the tractate Masechet Nedarim, oaths, vows. This is how you administer a vow. So the Talmud has another tractate called Shiborot, which means oaths, which deals with oaths that are administered by judges, dayanim, in court. And here's the law. When they administer an oath to him, that means the litigant, they tell him, you must know, sir, we are not asking you to swear on what you think the language of the oath means, but rather on the knowledge of God. I mean, makom is God, and on the knowledge of the court. In other words, if we have a general common understanding of a phrase or a word, you can't have a unique version of that word such that you can say it and swear to it being true, but we wouldn't consider it being true. You'll see in a minute. Because we find when Moses, when he administered an oath to the children of Israel, this is in the end of the book of Devarim, the parasha known as Nisavim. Amar lahen, he told them, De'u shelo al da'atchem ani mashbi'a etchem. You should all know that I'm not administering this oath according to your subjective reading of the language. Ela al da'at hamakom ve'al da'ati. Rather, on God's knowledge just means some kind of objective use of language, and da'ati on the way I understand language. Shene'emar, we don't have to quote these pisukim, but they come from Nisavim. Now the Talmud asked the following question. Lama li lememra lehachi. Why would you have to tell the litigant or the witness in rabbinic court that you're warning him that if he takes an oath, he can't interpret language in a subjective way so as to get out of the oath? He has to interpret language the way we normally understand the words. Why do we need to tell him that? Lama le memrahi. Why do you have to tell him that? Mishum kanya de Rava, because of the cane of Rava. It was a famous case, El Caño de Rava. And before we get there, we need a little more background. We'll study this probably in 15 minutes from now or so. So there's a case called Caña de Rava where one of the litigants took an oath and he had something to do with a cane. And he was kind of not the most moral person, which is precisely why he's carrying a cane. So now, we'll skip that for a minute. And here, let me tell you a little bit of background. We need to understand this sugya from the laws of oaths. And here we go. This is, so what is binding on all Jews? You know, you've heard this rabbi said A and that rabbi said B, and they come from different times and different places. And there's like a smorgasbord of rabbinic opinions on most issues of Jewish practice or law. But we Sephardim, in most of the countries we lived in, even before the expulsion, we kind of accepted Maimonides' restatement of the law because he's the only person who ever restated the entire corpus of Jewish law from soup to nuts in 1,000 chapters. That book is called the Mishneh Torah. And when the Maran Joseph Caro made the Shulchan Aruch, he pretty much copied and pasted about half of the Mishneh Torah and then added some additions to make the Jewish law more acceptable to the Ashkenazi community. So pretty much he took Maimonides' restatement and then took some additions made to it by Rabbeinu Asher, who was a Hacham in Spain and who had moved from Germany. Okay, now, so when I want to find a concise, clear, organized statement of any topic of Jewish law, I go to the Mishneh Torah. And this portion is called the laws of claimant and counterclaimant, ta'an v'nit'an, because that's what a judge sees. He sees two litigants. The first guy tells a story. Everything's fine. We understand it. And then the next guy gets up and it's a totally different story. And that's what happens in court. And now the judges have the burden to sort it all out and figure out who's telling the truth or what claims are being raised, who has the burden of proof, and what do we do? So, if you say to your friend, you owe me $100, means non-real property, money or silver or gold or objects, you owe me a truck full of beef hides, anything like that. And the counterclaimant or the defendant, let's say, he says, I admit that I owe half of what you just said, or a third of what you just said. It wasn't $1,000, it was $300. But yes, I admit I owe you $300. The defendant pays what he admits, and he takes an oath by Torah law that he doesn't owe the rest. And that's it. So whatever you admit to, that's what you pay. You don't pay any more, and you just take an oath. Now, an oath has the name of God in it, so we assume most of the people will not lie under oath. It's not like in American court where you just say, so help me God. Actually, you say the full name of God, and you're holding a Sefer Torah, and it's a big ordeal. Most Jews would, at the moment that they're doing it, they wouldn't be able to lie. It's too much. So, you swear that you don't owe the rest, which is a law of the Torah. There's a pasuk in Shemot which talks about litigants like this, and here it is: Al kol devar pesha, al shor, al hamor, etc., etc., etc. Asher yomar ki hu zeh. I underline this because this is a very fundamental linguistic point. Do you know the difference? So in Hebrew there's two words. One of them is hu, and one of them is zeh. Do you know what they mean? So zeh means this. You're pointing at something. Hu is something you're referring to in conversation, but it's not in front of you. So you're saying it means that. So if you say ki hu, that $100 you just, or $1,000 you just said you claim that I owe you, zeh, it's not 100, 1,000, it's 300. That is really this. Zeh means this. Zeh is when you're pointing at the object. So the pasuk says, you swear when anybody says ki hu, that claim you just made, it's really a third of what you said it is. Al Elohim yabod devar shnehem. In that case, they go to the judges and they present their case, and asher yarshiun Elohim, what the judges decide is who owes, yishalem. This is talking about a case where one's a thief, but in the general case, you always have to swear. Now here, let's see. Let's go. This is the restatement of the law. Let's see. Oh, en lecha mechoyab shiboa min haTorah hos mishelosha. So there's only 3 cases or 3 types of claims where from the Torah you are required to take an oath, recite God's name, and swear by the God of Israel, and you say his name, that you don't owe. And here they are. Somebody who admitted, I owe you only half. I only owe you a third. That case I just described above. Or someone who there's only one witness. but he has a very clean story. In Judaism, you need 2 witnesses. So what do you do if there's 1 witness? The guy doesn't have to pay what the witness says, but he has to swear that he doesn't owe it. We have shomer, or a baili. A baili in English law means you put something in somebody's possession to watch it for you and take care of it. A consignment is also a form of bailment. So if I leave my watch in your store, and you're a watch store, and I leave it on consignment, and you let it get stolen, or you're negligent and somebody, your janitor, destroys it when he's cleaning up, you owe me, you're responsible. Those are the 3 cases. Any other case, you're not required to swear. But, and here we go now, Aval Hachmei Talmud Tikenu Sheishavah Hanitba Bechol Elu Shivat Hesed. They invented a rabbinic oath, not obligated from the Torah. It's called Shivat Hesed. And they said, even in every single case, besides the formal 3 cases where the Torah requires it, we're going to add a rabbinic kind of oath that's called Shivat Hesed. But ve'ena ka'ain shel Torah, but it's not the same as the biblical one. Lefi she'en ba nekitar hefes. In the biblical case, you have to hold a Sefer Torah. The only time you don't is if you're a haham. In that case, you could hold the tefillin. Why is that? Because the tefillin are considered to be like a zipped drive or a condensed version of the entire Torah. And if you're a haham, you know how to generate the entire Torah from the tefillin. But if you're a regular layman, you have to hold an actual Sefer Torah and swear in the name of the God of Israel that I don't owe any more than the 300 I just admitted to. But in a Shivat Hesed, this rabbinic oath, you don't have to touch anything. You don't have to hold the Sefer Torah. You don't have to hold the tefillin. You don't have to hold anything. That's an important detail you need to know. And therefore, okay, I think that's all we have here. Yeah, we'll skip that part. So this is a lot of rabbinic Hebrew and maybe a little difficult. So now let's study this Sugya in Nedarim 24b, which is the one that's more accurately preserved in Don Quixote. And we'll see why in a moment. So here's the Mishnah. Nidre Havai, baseless, silly vows. Amar Konam Imlora'it, for example, if someone said, I take a vow, if I didn't see on that street or in that freeway 600,000 people, Ke'olem Israel, at one time. Im lora'iti nahash kekorat bet habad. Or if I didn't see a snake that's as big as a loom pole. A loom is, where you weave, and it's pretty tall. It's about, could be 9 feet tall. And there's 2 of them on the side, and then you string the warp and the weft across those poles. So there was very strong wooden beams, 2 verticals and 1 cross on top. That's a korat bet habad, the pole of a loom. So someone said that's huge. There's no such thing as a snake that's as big as a loom beam. But the person taking the vow, because he's exaggerating, he wants you to believe him. So he says, well, I'll take a vow. You don't believe me? I'll take a vow. I saw on that road, it was so crowded, it was like the nation of Israel leaving Egypt. Or I saw on that field a snake that was as big as a beam of a loom. Okay, so what are we talking about? How could this be? What kind of baseless vow could this be? And then the Talmud begins. Tana means a Tanaitic tradition that wasn't included in the Mishnah. Nidre Havai Mutarin. If you take a baseless vow, there's no penalty. Shibu'at Havai, but if you take an oath and you say God's name on the same language, the same phrase, the same story you're insisting that we should believe, Asurin, you are obligated, even if it's a total exaggeration. And how could this be? To cut to the chase, I left out some irrelevant portions. Ella Amarava, they're trying to tell us in this legal text, how could it be that you have a baseless oath? Be'omer ya'asiru perot ha'olam alai bishbu'ah. If somebody says, I swear to you by God, the Adonai, the God of Israel, that I saw, and if I'm lying, I can never eat fruit ever again. All the perot ha'olam are forbidden to me. Ya'asiru perot ha'olam. If I'm lying that I saw 600,000 people on that street. Like I saw 600,000 people on 42nd Street in Manhattan. You're never going to find 600,000 people on 42nd Street in Manhattan. He's exaggerating. But if he goes ahead and takes the oath, then he can never eat fruit again. So Rabbah is saying we enforce this kind of thing even though we know it's exaggerated because we don't want people to do it. Amar le Rabbana le Rab Ashe ve'vilma hay gabra kina deshum shema nehaza ve'asik lehon shema ole Misraim. What if he was really telling the truth? Except when he says ole Misraim, those people who came out of Egypt, he's not referring to humans. He saw an ant's nest and he saw like more than 600,000 ants. So he calls it ole Misraim for the number, but he doesn't mean really people. He means ants. Shum shemane is ants. He really saw a nest of ants. Kina de shum shemane. Ve'asik lehon, but he decided to call them Shema. He like imposed a name on them of ole Misraim as the people who had committed the exodus from Egypt. V'shapir mishteba. Therefore, he's swearing truthfully. Maybe what if that in his mind that's what he's doing? Are you still going to say he can never eat fruit again? Are we going to enforce an exaggerative oath, even where we know he's using language metaphorically? Amarle, well, Rabbah said, Ki mishteba, ada'ata didan mishteba. You remember we read this phrase at the very beginning that you give people a warning when they take an oath, that it's not according to your subjective use of language, but it's according to general, conventional meaning of terms that any reasonable person would understand. So, Ki mishteba, when someone takes an oath, ada'ata didan mishteba. He uses language the way we understand it, according to our mind, not according to his. Ve'anan la maskinan nafshin ashum shemane. And we never identify ants as people. So if you refer to an ant's nest as the 600,000 people who left Egypt, you're lying. The oath is false, and the penalty you articulated for yourself is binding on you. So another person in this yeshiva, the Sugyot and the Talmud are really snapshots of what happened, the give and take between the members of the faculty of the famous academies in Babylonia. So someone else says, why are you imposing this rule of law that an oath taker cannot use his own language? If you know what he means, and everybody knows what he means, and he's exaggerating, why can't he say that? Why can't he say there was more water there than Noah's flood? He doesn't mean Noah's flood. It means a lot of water. So, Mr. Rabbah, you're saying that we have to enforce according to the literal meaning of the words, the way we would understand them, even though we know he may be exaggerating. How do you know? Here's a source that says the opposite. When they, the judges, impose the oath on him, they tell him, you should know, Mr. Litigant, not on a condition in your own heart we are administering this oath, but rather on our own mind and on the mind of the court in general. It means what any judge would understand your words to be. So why do we have this rule, which we read about at the beginning of the class, this thing that they tell them, you can't swear according to your own subjective understanding, you have to swear according to common understanding. Why we have this rule? Is it not la'apoke de'asik lehul iskondere ve'asik lehon shema zuzeh? What if you're saying, I swear to you that there were 5,000 gold coins on that street. And you don't mean gold coins for real. What you mean is like checkers. Like they had these games, board games, or like tawale pieces, backgammon pieces. And let's say there was 5,000 of them or 200 of them. So you call them coins because they look like coins and you thought you'd be cute with the language. So doesn't this show that someone could try to make an oath normally? And if you don't give the warning, then they're okay? No, that's not what we have this. That's not what this rule here is about. This rule here that you can't, that we warn you that you must use language in a way we would understand it, not the way you would understand it. That's to exclude the case of the cane of Rabbah, the El Caño de Rabbah. And now we're going to read that Sugya. And this is the one, and then I'll tell you why it's a bit faulty, and then we'll read it again in Don Quixote, and you're going to see some significant differences. And then I'll explain to you how the version in Quixote is really the original. There was a person, that he claimed against another person, his pal, money. So he sued him in the court, in the Beit Din, in Pumbedita. That was the Babylonian academy where Rabbah was the Rosh Yeshiva and the Chief Justice. Amarle la love. So the plaintiff, the way the court works is the plaintiff speaks first. He has a claim against somebody. So the Rabbah or the judge says, okay, sir, proceed. Tell us what your claim is. What is your claim? Why are we in court today? Amarle la love. So he tells the borrower, Zil pirali. Pay me, let's say 1,000 zuzin, 1,000 coins. Amarle, the defendant says, Piraticha, I paid you. Amarle Rava, imken zil ishteba le defar'atehe. So the judge says, okay, if you paid him, go and swear to him that you paid him. Azal v'aite kanya. V'yahib zuze begave. What this borrower did, who's the defendant borrower did, is he took a cane, he brought a cane, and he had secreted away the money that he's being claimed for, that he's being dunned for, we say in English, inside the cane. That's why I read at the beginning of this class the Mishnah in Kelim, to show you that people with kanyos sometimes cannot be trusted. So he had this cane and he hid, let's say, the 10 crowns, let's say 10 gold coins inside. And when he came into the court, he would kind of pretend he's limping. So he limps, he takes a step, he leans on the cane, all to garner sympathy, to make everybody feel bad, not to believe him. And why is this plaintiff bothering him? He claims he already paid him. Like putting on an act, very similar to, and that's why I study with you all, the Mishnah in Kelim, which describes how people with canes often are playing a con. So this is the same thing here. So he walks into court in this limping manner with the cane and a step and the cane, and the mistamich means to lean on, the azil to go. So he leans, he steps, he leans, he steps, and he makes a show of like he's physically weak. So then he tells the plaintiff, his lender, please hold this, would you please hold my cane? So if an old guy who's limping hands you his cane, what are you going to do? So you hold the cane. Nasab Sefer Torah, he took the Sefer Torah, and he swore an oath that he paid him, he paid him, means the lender, the plaintiff, everything that he had of his, means everything that the borrower had of his, of the lender, in his hands. Now this is cute language, but you'll see in a moment. This lender, Ragaz, he got angry As soon as he heard the guy swear, because he knows it's false, he never got paid. That's why he's here. He asked him 100 times. He doesn't say anything. So he said, finally, I'm suing you. So he brings him to court. When he heard him holding the Sefer Torah, it says Nasab Sefer Torah, this borrower, holding the Sefer Torah and lying, he got so mad that Tabre Lahu Kanya, he broke the Kanyo. He smashed the cane. V'ishtepach hanhu zuzeh le'ar'a, and the hidden coins fell on the ground. V'ishtekach yakoshta ishteba, and it was apparent to everyone there that koshta, in truth, ishteba, he had sworn. So let me explain to you exactly what's going on here. Borrower is summoned to court by lender. Lender says, you owe me 10 gold coins. Borrower says, I paid you. Judge, Rava, says, okay, Mr. Borrower, swear, take an oath with God's name, the whole 9 yards, that you paid him. Now this borrower had walked into court leaning on the cane and stepping and leaning. So he has this cane, and the cane has inside it the coins. So obviously he didn't pay him. He's got them with him now. And now he's going to impose a bit of a ruse. He tells the lender, would you please hold my cane? And then the borrower took a Sefer Torah, because remember we studied above, you take a Sefer Torah for certain kinds of oaths. And he swore. Now here's the rub. The para'eh, the Aramaic root pe resh ayin, has two meanings. Number one, to pay. Like you give someone a check or you give someone some cash in their hand and they know they're being paid. Number two, to place an object in somebody's hand. You don't have to give them any notice. You just place it in their hand. If you place something in their hand, that's called para'eh. It means to put in a hand. So he swore that he put in the hand everything that he had, everything that the lender owned, all of the lender's property that he had in his hand. So in his hand goes both ways. It means everything of the lenders that he had with him in his hand, and in the hand of the lender, he placed the object. So it's very similar to those cute locutions that we went over at the beginning of this class. You say one thing and to you it makes sense, but it's a cute use of language. So he's exploiting the dual semantic of the Aramaic root para. And he says, I paid to him everything that I had in his hand. The lender doesn't have to know that he's being paid if you just take the staff and put it in his hand. And that's what he was swearing was true. So he would only be able to swear this if the lender agreed to take the cane, which is why he said, would you take my cane? Now, in the story, it looks like he's giving the cane because he has to hold the Sefer Torah. So how can he can't hold the cane at the same time? Number one, it's vergüenza. We consider a cane a mundane object, and you don't hold the Sefer Torah and a cane at the same time. And I'll show you next time a source of law for that. But a cane, bear in mind, a cane is a mundane object. So is a handkerchief where they used to put coins or money and then tie it. Have you ever seen that? My grandfather used to do that. That and a cane are considered mundane objects. You never pick those up on, let's say, Shabbat or Moed. It's like vergüenza. If you would go in the temple or the synagogue like that, that's considered mundane. So if he's going to hold a Sefer Torah to take an oath, he can't have a cane. So he tells the lender, the plaintiff, oh, would you hold my cane so I can swear? And then while the lender's holding the cane, he swears, and it's a true oath, but the lender doesn't know he's being paid because it's this secreted hole that only those concaños come up with. So he breaks it, and now we all see the ruse, and there's like a denouement, an exposing of what he did. So the Sugya uses this double semantic of para. Bear in mind for next time, how are you going to say that in Spanish? Because in Don Quixote, the same story we just read now in the Sugya, in the Talmud of Nedarim, is recanted in Spanish. And the judge is not the Rabbah, the judge is the fat Sancho Panza, who's the sidekick of Don Quixote. And that's how Cervantes, recreates the story or modifies it to fit the context of his book. But how is he going to deal with this in Hebrew? In Aramaic, para means to pay, and it also means to stick an object in a hand. How is he going to deal with that? So stay tuned next week. So now, there's a few problems with this story, which is why I say this girsa is wrong. Do you remember at the beginning when I told you there's a biblical oath, shibuat deoraita it's called, and then there's a rabbinic oath, shibuat hesed? The biblical oath applies, and the difference between them is in the rabbinic oath, you don't hold a holy object. You don't hold a Sefer Torah. Or if you're a hacham, you don't hold tefillin. In the rabbinic mitzvah, in the rabbinic oath, you don't do anything. In the biblical oath, you do. And when is a biblical oath required? There's 3 instances. The first instance is the one that applies to us. When you admit in part, remember the kihu zeh, that you say kihu, that which he claimed is really this. It's really, he claimed 1,000, it's really 300. That's when you take a biblical oath. You don't take a biblical oath if you deny the total claim. If he says you owe me $1,000 and the borrower, the alleged borrower says, I don't owe you a dime, 0, you don't take the biblical oath. So how would it ever be? This guy says, pay him. He says, I paid everything, means I don't owe anything now. The judge says, then swear. He hands the cane to the lender and swears. Why would he be holding a Sefer Torah? This is not an instance of a biblical oath. Something doesn't jive. So what kind of shibu'ah is this? It's a shibu'at hesed, rabbinic one, not shibu'ah deoraita, not an oath delale. Was the nit'an, was the borrower modeh b'miksata te'ana, was he admitting to a part of the claim? No. So how could he swear that he paid? Oh, and number 3, how could he swear that he paid? He did not pay the lender. I already explained that to you. He didn't pay, but he did para'eh, and that verb makes sense in Aramaic, and he actually did, by putting the cane in the hand of the lender, he actually did para'eh him, but he did not pay him. And that was the secret of it. So there's a problem here, though. How is this going on? The Gemara it doesn't make sense. This story cannot possibly be, because this instance of swearing would never hold a Sefer Torah. So something's wrong. And we will see the answer to that when we read it in Spanish. Now, this is the English of it. We'll read it in English so everybody understands, and we'll read it again in the original. This is the original text of Cervantes. And by the way, my claim here is that Cervantes himself was a converso. And just to show you, he uses an interesting phrase. This doesn't have to do particularly with the story of the lender with the cane and the hidden coins, but he calls him que sin ti, without you, yo me siento tibio. I don't remember what tibio means. You would be X. Desmazalado y confuso. Unlucky and confused. Desmazalado. A goy would not use that word. Maybe a goy who was formerly a Muslim might use an Arabic version of mazal, which is not the Hebrew mazalado. So nobody would ever think of mazalado and desmazalado except someone of Jewish background. So we'll read the English and the Spanish. The Spanish is very, very nice. There's a lot of cues and clues as to who Cervantes really is, the way he uses this language. And you're going to see that the correct version of this story in the Talmud, the correct version of this Talmudic Sugya, which is wrong here because of this detail, is corrected in the version of Cervantes. I know we only have a few minutes left, but are there any questions? If there are, just shout it out.
Any questions, you have the ability to unmute. So you can either try one at a time, please, because we want to do this manually, or type into the chat.
I have a question on the girsa that we find in the Vilna.
Yes.
Chacham. Is it due to just not being precise, or is it due to censorship that the Vilna has an incorrect girsa?
I'll tell you, that's a very good question. So in this case, it's due to internal censorship. The actual original words, which I'll tell you next time, they thought the Jews who printed the Talmud or who used in Spain when they copied over the manuscripts, they left out some words because they thought those words were too Christian sounding. They thought it was a reference. It could be seen as a reference to the Trinity. There's the word shoshelita, which means in Aramaic chain, in Ladino cadena. There was something, not a Sefer Torah, in this room, which even when you administer the rabbinic oath, you don't have to hold anything, but usually somebody from the Beit Din, an officer of the court, he's holding a Sefer Torah, or there is some holy object in the room. So you'd be afraid to lie with God's name, even if there's a Sefer Torah in the back, or a tefillin there, or something. So there was a something, and the Sugya cut it out and inserted Sefer Torah in its place. That something had the word shoshelita in it, which means chain, but it also sounds like three, milashon shalosh. And when in Christian Spain environment, the Jewish Hachamim who copied over the Talmud, when they heard shoshelita, they said, "Oh, that sounds like the Trinity. We can't have that. It's going to sound like the guy, like there's some Christological oath going on here. No good. Let's change the text." That's what I think happened.
Wow, thank you.
Okay, I think that does it, Ethan, with 1 minute to go.
Perfect timing.
Okay, well, I watch the clock as I go.
Well, with that, we're going to close for this evening. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening. Please come back next week, same time at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, to join us for part 2 of this wonderful series. And also make sure to see the same link as well. You can find it on our website and also via email. With that, I wish you all noche buena, and thank you so much, Rabbi.
One more thing, if anybody
Sure,
has access to it, and you can get it on the internet in both languages, read Don Quixote chapter 45 in book 2. All right, very good.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi, and everyone, wishing you a wonderful evening. Noche buena.
Okay, noche buena. Thank you very much. So those is Kiste. Bye-bye.